Picture this, a city of marble and fire, where emperors walk like gods, and every whisper can change the fate of an empire. Rome, 1st century AD. Markets buzzing, senators plotting in the shadows, soldiers in bronze armor marching down stone avenues that smell like olive oil, incense, and ambition. Power here isn't just held, it consumes. And in the heart of this glittering machine stands one man who once promised glory, art, and prosperity before darkness took root inside him. Now look a little closer, past the triumphal arches, past the golden statues. Somewhere inside the imperial palace, the most powerful ruler in the world stares at a face that doesn't belong in this century or in this story at all. It's young, fragile, unmistakably beautiful, but it carries a secret, a face he believes he has seen before, a face he refuses to lose again. Because this is not just a tale about Rome. It's a story about obsession that slips into madness, about grief so sharp it reshapes reality, about what happens when a ruler decides that a memory, a ghost, is worth more than a living human soul. Today, we step into the life of someone history almost erased, someone forced not only to live in the shadow of an emperor's pain, but to become that shadow. This isn't mythology. This happened. And once you learn the truth, you'll never look at ancient power, or the people crushed beneath it, the same way again. When Nero first stepped into the light of the imperial court, Rome breathed out as if a storm had finally passed. He was only 16, bright and theatrical, the kind of ruler who looked not at the treasury first but at the theaters, the festivals, the public spaces where citizens felt seen. He lowered taxes to earn peace where force would have sufficed. He bankrolled games and performances that made the poor feel wealthy for a day. He even took the stage himself, a decision that scandalized a crusty aristocracy and electrified the crowds who suddenly had a Caesar who loved what they loved. For a brief, golden window, it seemed possible that culture could replace cruelty, that music and spectacle could do the work of the sword. That promise was real, but so was the architecture of danger that came with it. Absolute power changes not only what a man can do, but what he hears. The court around Nero formed a dome of agreeable echoes. Counsel hardened into flattery. Warnings softened into compliments. And when conflict appeared, it did not challenge him in public. It curdled in private, breeding paranoia. Every door closed a beat too slowly. Every laugh carried a second meaning. The higher Nero climbed into adoration, the further he drifted from the ground where truth could meet his ear. That isolation didn't arrive overnight. It built itself one decision at a time. A general reassigned, a senator disgraced, a confidant promoted for loyalty over competence. By the mid-60s, Nero lived in a palace of mirrors, and each reflection smiled back. He learned to trust applause because applause never argued. But the empire he ruled was not a theater audience. It was a machine of provinces and roads, taxes and grain, armies and governors whose patience wore thin when their ruler chose festival schedules over frontier reports. Then came Poppaea Sabina, the woman Rome could not stop staring at. She was not merely beautiful. She was strategic. She used reputation like a blade sheathed in silk. In a city where men pretended ambition was a virtue reserved for them, Poppaea moved with a clarity that made admirers into allies and doubters into footnotes. Nero met her and saw not only a partner, but a mirror of the self he preferred, the impresario emperor, the aesthete of victory, the man whose taste became law. What began as romance hardened into possession. The palace narrowed around Poppaea the way a fist closes around a gem. Guards were posted for her protection, which is what power always says when it wants a person to itself. Gifts arrived in caravans, spices, silks, perfumes that turned rooms into distant countries. Sculptors recreated her face in marble and bronze until Nero could walk a hallway and see her as a procession of eternal copies. He wanted her near when he was awake, present when he slept, and available as proof that his vision of beauty, of rule, of himself, was not a fantasy but a fact. But Poppaea was not a prop. She had a mind and used it. In a court trained to read the emperor's weather and change its mood to match, she stood in the rain when she had to. She questioned decisions. She spoke plainly about priorities. She punctured the theater when it risked replacing the state. That honesty carried danger. And the danger multiplied with Nero's growing dependence on a world that never contradicted him. A public figure who thrives on performance can survive criticism from enemies. What he cannot easily survive is truth from someone he loves. The sources disagree about the details that followed, but they agree about the shape of the tragedy. One day, argument edged into fury. Poppaea was pregnant. She confronted Nero about his obsessions, about spectacle over duty, about the cost of being a god to the crowd and a stranger to his own responsibility. The room filled with a pressure that does not appear in marble reliefs or victory coins. Rage doesn't need witnesses to be real. It needs only a moment without restraint. In that moment, it found Nero. The blow, whether a single strike or a flurry, landed with the force of a life bending the wrong way. When it ended, Poppaea was dying. The child she carried would never see Rome. What happens to a man who can command legions when he meets something he cannot command? Grief should teach limits. Power often refuses to learn. Nero did not accept the finality of death. He staged against it. He preserved Poppaea's body in violation of custom. He raised monuments to her, as if stone could stand in for breath. He spoke to her in rooms where silence replied. He ordered the court to treat her presence as ongoing, a performance that formalized denial into etiquette. Banquets kept her chair empty like a ritual, and the city learned that certain fictions were safer than the truth. This was not love as the poets promised. It was grief weaponized, memory turned into mandate. And in that fragile, unsteady mindset, Nero saw a face in the palace that resembled the one he had lost. Sporus was a teenager trained in the administrative systems of the household, a freed former slave whose education afforded him small avenues of influence and vast exposure to risk. He had done nothing but exist in the wrong place at the moment when a broken emperor needed proof that the past could be resurrected. The resemblance was enough to invite a dangerous idea. If memory couldn't be trusted and death wouldn't answer, perhaps likeness could be forced into replacement. The logic of a stage became law. Cast the part, design the costume, rehearse the role until the audience forgets it's a performance. Everything that followed would move according to that grim script. The rooms that once held laughter turned into workshops for erasing a person. The tools of luxury, jewelry, fabric, cosmetics, were recalibrated as instruments of control. Lessons in posture and voice became disciplines of disappearance. An identity was not merely hidden, it was overwritten. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the empire took the measure of its ruler and found too many deficits. Governors muttered. Soldiers remembered that loyalty is not the same as worship. The treasury counted costs that spectacle does not repay. The city that had once cheered Nero's songs now listened for rumors of revolt. The distance between emperor and earth widened until only catastrophe could close it. Inside, Nero held fast to the narrative that made the unbearable survivable, that the woman he loved could be made present again if everyone agreed to the terms. It is tempting to dismiss this as decadence, to reduce the story to salacious detail and move on. But the core is not scandal. It is the oldest political warning told in the quietest voice. When truth cannot enter the room, someone else will be ordered to take its place. When power cannot admit loss, a living person will be made to pay the difference. That is the threshold where our story pauses. Rome teetering between performance and reality, an emperor haunted by the echo of what he destroyed, and a young life about to be taken apart and refashioned to fit the size of another man's grief. From the outside, it will look like ceremony, a retinue, a wardrobe, a title bestowed. From the inside, it will feel like vanishing. And once the curtain rises, no one in that hall will be allowed to ask what the part costs the person forced to play it. In the great tapestry of Rome's history, love stories rarely end quietly. They either ignite civilizations or leave blood on marble floors. Nero's love for Poppaea Sabina began as fascination, blossomed into adoration, and ultimately mutated into something far more dangerous than passion. It became a hunger to own not only her presence, but her identity, her breath, her very existence. Poppaea did not enter Nero's life as a silent ornament. She arrived like a gust of warm Mediterranean wind, sharp, vibrant, fragrant with ambition. She was the type of woman who understood the currency of attention and wielded it expertly. She had lived among senators, courtiers, and generals long enough to know that Rome rewarded charm but respected strategy. Beauty could open a door, intelligence kept it open, and Poppaea had both in abundance. Their connection was immediate, magnetic, intoxicating, reckless. But the palace was not built to hold two blazing stars in one chamber. Nero, accustomed to being the sole axis around which admiration revolved, found in Poppaea something more than a lover. He found a reflection of the power he believed he deserved. She admired his dreams of artistic immortality and whispered encouragement where others offered uneasy silence. She challenged his hesitations, laughed at his critics, and molded herself into the only voice in the palace that dared to sound like truth. But admiration, when paired with insecurity, becomes volatile. Nero didn't just want Poppaea's heart. He needed her approval the way a drowning man needs air. Every praise she offered solidified his self-image. Every criticism struck deeper than any senator's dagger. Poppaea's spirit, fierce and articulate, was the one force in the empire that could touch something fragile inside him. The higher he climbed into delusion, the more desperately he clung to her certainty. He loved her not as a partner, but as a sanctuary from the parts of himself he refused to face. As their bond deepened, the palace began to contract around her. At first it seemed romantic, protection, comfort, devotion. But love can sometimes be the first mask jealousy wears. Guards at her door, servants vetted for loyalty. The subtle reshaping of social circles until she stood in a world designed entirely by Nero. The empire had countless citizens, but Poppaea's life shrank to one orbit. The palace walls, adorned with frescoes in gold, tightened like velvet chains. There were gifts, endless gifts. Jewels brought from the east that sparkled like captured stars. Fragrance distilled from rare blossoms that perfumed entire chambers. Fabrics as soft as whispered secrets, dyed in colors reserved for royalty. The empire bent its routes and its riches toward her feet. But gifts are not always generosity. Sometimes they are declarations. I gave this to you. I made this for you. You belong to me. Nero filled hallways with statues sculpted in her likeness, commissioned portraits that immortalized her skin under divine light. He plastered Rome with her face, publicly elevating her to a pedestal higher than his own. Yet the more he worshipped her image, the less he seemed capable of recognizing her humanity. Idolization slowly became erasure. The Poppaea in his mind grew larger than the woman in front of him. And that is where obsession begins. Not when you love someone too much, but when you love them in a shape they can no longer fit. She noticed. Of course she noticed. Poppaea, sharp-eyed and seasoned in palace politics, understood power as a game played with both charm and caution. She benefited from Nero's devotion, but also sensed the fragility beneath it. Fragility in emperors is never harmless. It is a chasm beneath the marble that swallows dissent and crushes those who step too close to the edge. Yet she refused to surrender her mind. She spoke plainly when decisions endangered Rome. She rolled her eyes when Nero's performances fell short of genius. She teased him, corrected him, held him accountable in ways no senator or general dared. She believed her closeness to him granted safety, believed love granted immunity. It was a miscalculation that history has seen repeated in palace after palace, throne after throne. Then came the turning point, pregnancy, a moment that should have symbolized continuity, legacy, life. Instead, it heightened every pressure already fermenting in Nero's world. Suddenly, Poppaea was not only a partner, but a vessel of imperial future. The stakes around her doubled, and Nero's possessiveness sharpened into a blade honed by paranoia. The court grew quieter around them, afraid to breathe too loudly. His temper, once theatrical, turned unpredictable. He was a man navigating grief before loss, fearing abandonment while still holding the person he adored. On that fateful day, when argument ignited into tragedy, the palace walls heard a sound they were not built to echo, the break of something sacred. The emperor who fancied himself a patron of beauty destroyed the most precious thing he claimed to love. The silence afterward was heavier than mourning. It was disbelief coated in terror. Even the marble statues, those silent witnesses, seemed to recoil. In the aftermath, grief stormed through Nero like a wounded god lashing out at reality. He refused the natural rituals of death. He commanded that Poppaea remain preserved, untaken by flame or time. Her chamber remained set, her seat reserved at banquets, her presence demanded in conversations as if air still filled her lungs. Court life twisted into theater again, but now it was tragedy, the kind where everyone performs because the truth has become lethal. The empire watched its emperor unravel, trapped between power and heartbreak. Advisors became actors. Servants became spectators. Rome's most powerful men bowed not only to Nero's authority, but to his delusion. The palace glowed with gold and incense, but its heart was cold, hollow, and haunted. Here, mourning crossed into madness. Love had not simply turned to sorrow. It calcified into a monument where grief refused to let memory stay memory. It had to become flesh again. It had to be resurrected. Somewhere deep in that palace, in corridors heavy with expectation and fear, Nero began to look for replacement. An echo, a reflection, a living vessel for a ghost he refused to let go. And when his gaze eventually fell on the young Sporus, delicate features and haunting resemblance, the chain between obsession and cruelty completed its circle. The tragedy that followed did not begin with violence. It began with longing, the most dangerous kind, longing fueled by power, sharpened by guilt, and given permission by a world too afraid to say no. Love had cracked open into possession. Obsession had fermented into control. And in that silent shift, someone else's life was about to disappear beneath the weight of another person's grief. History often remembers emperors as statues, but here the stone bleeds. And soon, one innocent boy would bleed with it. There are crossroads in history where a life doesn't simply change course, it is overwritten. The moment Nero's grief calcified into obsession, all of Rome held its breath, but no one felt the consequences more than a teenager who had never asked for the emperor's gaze. His name was Sporus. He did not enter this tragedy as a symbol. He entered as a person, young, educated enough to serve in noble households, freed from slavery, yet bound by the invisible chain that tethered all who lived too close to power, dependence, obligation, fear. In any other story, he might have lived quietly, grown into a role of modest influence, married, raised a family, faded into Rome's vast populace. Instead, he became a vessel, not for honor or duty, but for one man's refusal to accept mortality. Nero first saw him not as a servant or youth with potential, but as a haunting resemblance. The angles of his face, the softness around the eyes, these were details only a grieving mind would elevate into revelation. Grief is not rational. It is a whisper that promises impossible bargains. And in the emperor's fractured mind, Sporus was not Sporus at all. He was a doorway, a flicker of Poppaea's presence, a chance to reverse the one thing power could not command. Rome had seen rulers build temples to lost loves. It had seen emperors adopt heirs to secure legacy. But it had never witnessed what came next, the quiet, horrifying machinery of transforming a living person into a replica of the dead. It began with isolation, not the violent kind, but the quiet version disguised as privilege. Sporus was removed from familiar spaces, housed in private chambers once reserved for Poppaea's ladies. Attendants appeared not to serve him, but to shape him. Tailors measured his body for silk robes. Jewelers studied his features to design adornments that softened his youth into something ethereal. Hairdressers traced the contours of his scalp, determining the curls that would mirror imperial coiffure. Every gesture was tender in technique and brutal in purpose. Language shifted around him. No longer he. No longer Sporus. A new name whispered in corridors like an invocation. Sabina, Poppaea's name, resurrected through him. To the palace, it became a command. To Sporus, it was the first burial of self. At first, he may have resisted. History does not record his early thoughts. History rarely records the thoughts of those who suffer. But imagine the silence of those rooms. Imagine being taught to stand not as you were, but as she once stood. To hold your hands with the grace she was praised for. To speak with the softness she used in private. Tutors would not have barked at him like soldiers. They would have corrected him with gentle firmness, as though training a delicate instrument. Every mirror became an enemy. Every lesson erased a fraction of who he had been. Before long, clothing was not costume but cage. Cosmetics were not decoration but mask. When the palace looked at him, it saw not a boy, not a survivor, but a triumph of delusion. A ghost made flesh. It is tempting to imagine that someone, a servant, a noble, a priest, stepped forward to defend him. But fear is a powerful silencer, especially in halls where truth could cost a life. The court complied not out of loyalty, but self-preservation. They greeted him with reverence. They bowed. They referred to him as Empress. They smothered reality beneath ritual. And Nero? He did not merely praise the resemblance, he believed it. The line between memory and presence blurred until he acted not beside an illusion, but inside it. He called Sporus by Poppaea's name. He reminisced about events Sporus had never lived. He demanded acknowledgement of shared memories that never existed. His grief, once private, became a theater the entire empire was forced to perform. Then came the wedding. Not a secret ceremony. Not a private vow whispered over relics of the dead. A state affair, grand and public. Rome had watched emperors marry daughters of noble houses, foreign princesses, symbols of alliances. Now they watched Nero wed a youth remade into womanhood by decree. Witnesses bowed as though attending imperial continuity, not participating in the burial of an identity. And Sporus, draped in jewels once belonging to Poppaea, walked that path with composure history calls tragic. There was no space for rebellion. There was no voice loud enough to drown the emperor's grief. In that moment, survival meant surrender. Luxury, once a symbol of privilege, turned into a stage where every gesture required perfection. The palace chambers assigned to him glowed with polished bronze and fragrant oils, but a gilded cage does not free the bird inside. Servants tended to him with reverence, yet they saw only who he was ordered to be. Nobles addressed him with titles that praised not who he was, but who he replaced. Imagine waking every morning surrounded by objects that belonged to another life, another person. Imagine not only wearing their clothing, but their memory. Eating from plates chosen for their palate, sleeping in silk meant for their skin. Sporus lived not beside a ghost, but inside one. And yet he endured. That is the part history too often forgets. Survival in such circumstances is not passivity. It is resistance in its quietest form. Every breath he took as himself, however deeply buried, defied the machinery of erasure. Rome, meanwhile, watched with fascination and dread. Senators whispered. Citizens speculated. Poets scribbled satire behind closed doors, careful not to breathe them in public. It is easy to condemn a mad emperor. Harder still when his shadow reaches every doorway. So they said nothing. But empires are not eternal, and delusion is brittle. Nero's grip on power loosened as the world outside the palace refused to bend like the world within. Revolt sparked. Loyalty fractured. Conspiracies germinated in taverns and barracks. The man who once commanded applause now heard only the rising call for his removal. When Nero fled Rome, terrified and cornered by rebellion, Sporus followed, not as partner, but as hostage to a grief that refused to release him even at the brink of collapse. As Nero faced death by his own hand, he reportedly called on Sporus for a final theatrical request, to mourn him as a wife. Even in ruin, delusion demanded obedience. And then, silence. An emperor's life ended by his own choosing. But Sporus did not gain freedom, only abandonment into a world that still saw him as artifact rather than boy. Passed between powerful men like an imperial trophy, a living reminder of madness, he became proof not of love, but of the devastation love can cause when corrupted by power. His story did not end in reunion with himself, but with a final act of autonomy, the only one left to him. Facing public humiliation in the arena, he chose his end. It was not surrender. It was reclamation. His first true choice since Nero's gaze fell upon him. History often honors conquerors and forgets the conquered. But in Sporus, we see a truth Rome rarely admits. That power, when broken by grief and sharpened by fear, does not only destroy those who wield it, but those forced to stand beneath it. And in the quiet tragedy of one young life, we find a question older than empire itself. When power tries to rewrite a person, what remains of the soul that resists being erased? From the outside, it looked like triumph. The palace glowed with hundreds of oil lamps, a living constellation under carved ceilings that told stories of Rome's might. Musicians tuned lyres and flutes, priests prepared sacred incense, and officials rehearsed their lines. The empire was about to witness a ceremony meant only for gods and emperors. But beneath the shimmer, beneath the ritual, lay something brittle and terrifying, the coronation of a ghost. Sporus, transformed by decree and suffocating discipline, stood at the heart of the spectacle. Silk clung to his slight frame, gold caught in his hair, and gems weighted his wrists and throat as if beauty itself had become a chain. He did not walk into the grand hall. He was guided, stage-managed by attendants with gentle hands and pitiless purpose. Each step felt borrowed, each breath rehearsed. This wasn't a wedding. It was a performance Rome was forced to applaud. Nero, radiant in imperial purple, looked at Sporus with a devotion that no one dared question. To him, this day was vindication. Proof that grief could be conquered, that love could be resurrected, that emperors could bend fate even when gods had refused him mercy. As vows were spoken, the air thickened, too still, too heavy, as though the walls themselves understood the blasphemy happening within them. Marriage rites meant to bless legacies and futures were recited over a boy robbed of both. The guests smiled, cheered, raised goblets. Yet beneath every polite expression lay dread, a private terror that one wrong glance, one flicker of truth, could become a death sentence. Some looked away as though their eyes might betray them. Others stared, hollow and obedient, practicing the art of survival in a palace that demanded performance over conscience. When the ceremony ended and the shouts of Ave reverberated through the marble halls, Nero placed a delicate veil over Sporus's head, a symbol of honor, and an invisible seal over his erased identity. The palace erupted in applause, but the sound felt like the roar of a cage closing. From that moment, Sporus lived not as a person but as an office. He was given private quarters adorned with silk and gold, luxurious, spacious, suffocating. Eunuchs attended him. Ladies-in-waiting addressed him as Augusta. Musicians played soft melodies as he dined. Perfumed baths were drawn, garments laid out each morning, protocols whispered into his ear like sacred rites. On the surface, it was privilege. In truth, it was captivity refined into elegance. Every room reminded him of Poppaea. Portraits, statues, perfume, tapestries depicting her as divine. Sporus woke to a dead woman's face and slept surrounded by her scent. Even the birds in the palace gardens sang beneath frescoes painted in her likeness. Rome's greatest palace had become a mausoleum for one woman, and Sporus was its living shrine. Nero expected him to accompany him everywhere: state dinners, chariot games, ceremonies. He sat beside the emperor on a throne too grand for someone who had no will left to claim. Senators bowed. Foreign envoys offered respects. Visitors marveled at the Empress of Rome, eyes flickering with bewilderment and fear. Some whispered behind silk fans. Others stared too long and were silently removed from court. The lie had become law, and the empire's elite learned to worship illusion. For Sporus, each public appearance was a test. One wrong gesture, one falter in voice, one look of confusion when Nero spoke to him as though he were Poppaea. These could mean disappearance or worse. So he perfected stillness. Performance became survival. His face, once youthful, now held a quiet vacancy, the look of someone who breathes carefully, so as not to disturb the world that has swallowed him whole. Time blurred. Seasons passed not by changing leaves, but by festival after festival, obligation after obligation, ritual after ritual. Sporus learned the rhythm of court life the way prisoners learn the sound of guards' footsteps. Every congratulation felt like a nail sealing the coffin of his former self. Yet traces of the boy remained, small sparks in the dark. A moment of lingering breath before stepping into the public eye. A quick glance at his reflection before the mask settled. A flicker of self-recognition, fleeting and painful. Resistance, when stripped of power, becomes internal. The quiet decision to know who you once were, even when the world insists you are someone else. Even as Sporus endured the theater of Rome, the empire itself began to crack. Outside the palace walls, Rome trembled with unrest. Grain shortages, military dissatisfaction, governors and generals whispering rebellion. While the emperor staged love, the empire staged dissent. Rumors spread like wildfire. Nero had not only lost touch with governance, he had lost touch with reality. His art, His vanity, his spectacles, they once amused, now they irritated. Soldiers in distant provinces began to march not for glory, but against imperial neglect. Senators whispered names of rivals. The Praetorian Guard, once Nero's shield, grew restless. And through it all, Sporus stood at his side, a silent witness to an unraveling that mirrored his own. When revolt finally erupted and Nero fled Rome under cover of night, Sporus followed, no longer a symbol of love, but a remnant of madness. They rode through countryside shadowed by fear, accompanied by only a few loyalists. Nero clung to delusion until the end, alternately begging for loyalty and fantasizing about theatrical suicide. In his final moments, he reportedly turned to Sporus and asked him to mourn him as a wife. Even then, even facing death, Nero demanded performance. When the emperor died and the echo of his final cry faded, the world did not stop for grief. Power rushed into the vacuum. Sporus, suddenly unanchored, became a relic of a fallen regime, and therefore a tool. He was taken by powerful men eager to claim imperial artifacts, passed like spoils, addressed as Empress, not out of respect, but as mockery of Nero's delusion. The violence against his identity did not end with the emperor. It mutated, weaponized by those who wished to humiliate what Nero represented. Though palace walls changed, the cage did not. Even freedom of movement meant nothing when one is trapped inside an identity carved by others. But fear has limits, and humiliation has a breaking point. When the new emperor, Vitellius, announced Sporus would be forced into public spectacle, a reenactment mocking his life and Poppaea's death, something in him refused to bend any further. He chose death, not as surrender, but as the only act left that belonged solely to him. Sporus did not die as an empress. He did not die as a symbol. He died reclaiming the one thing denied him from the moment Nero claimed him: autonomy. History teaches us through wars, treaties, and decrees. But sometimes, the quiet tragedy of a single life reveals more about the dangers of power than any battle ever could. In Sporus, we do not simply witness cruelty. We witness the obliteration of identity under the weight of obsession and the quiet, final rebellion of a soul that refused to vanish without choosing its own ending. In a world built on conquest, sometimes the greatest act of defiance is simply saying, "You do not get to finish writing me." Empires rarely fall in a single breath. They erode, like stone dissolved grain by grain in wind and time. And while Nero staged pageantry inside silk-curtained rooms, outside Rome the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Grain shipments faltered, senators whispered treason wrapped in polite greetings. Distant legions weighed their allegiance against their patience. The city that had once sung his praises now murmured with unease. Festivals could distract only so long. Grief disguised as glory could not govern a world. Sporus watched the unraveling not as a participant, but as a shadow tethered to collapsing power. From the vantage point beside Nero's throne, he saw more clearly than most. When generals withdrew their loyalty, when provinces declared rebellion, Sporus stood near enough to hear the tremor beneath Nero's voice as the emperor attempted to reassert control, like a conductor demanding harmony from an orchestra already abandoning the stage. There is a particular cruelty in witnessing downfall after surviving madness. For Sporus, Nero's collapse was not liberation. It was the collapse of the only reality he had been allowed to exist in, a cage made unbearable, yet still a cage familiar. When the Praetorian Guard, Rome's most elite protectors, turned against their emperor, palace corridors became echo chambers of panic. Messengers ran, marble floors trembled under frantic footsteps, and orders shifted from imperial command to desperate plea. Nero fled in disguise, slipping away from the city that once adored him. And Sporus followed, not by choice, but because choice had been stripped from him long ago. He rode under cover of night, a silent witness beside a man who was now more ghost than ruler. While Nero spoke of poetic ends and dramatic farewells, Sporus endured the journey like one final act of a tragedy he never auditioned for. Even then, Nero did not look at Sporus as a boy. He looked through him, at the echo of a woman long dead. When the end came, when Nero took his life rather than face humiliation at the hands of those who once cheered his name, the world did not pause to let Sporus breathe. Power does not grant mercy simply because one tyrant falls. Instead, a new cruelty began. The cruelty of being left alive in a world that still remembered what he had been forced to become. Without Nero, Sporus did not return to anonymity. He became a relic of madness, a trophy of scandal. Powerful men, eager to demonstrate their dominance over a fallen regime, took him into their households, not as a person, but as a living reminder of imperial decay. Each addressed him with titles that mocked rather than honored. Each demanded his presence not for affection, but for spectacle. Even in supposed freedom, he remained a prisoner. A bird cut loose from its cage only to find there are walls everywhere outside it too. There are silences history forgets to record. The silence of rooms where Sporus sat alone, stripped of even the illusion of belonging. The silence of nights where he remembered who he once was before mirrors and crowns were weaponized against him. The silence of moments when breathing felt like rebellion, when existing felt like defiance. Rome's new emperor, Vitellius, had a talent for cruelty cloaked in theatricality. When he announced that Sporus would be forced into a public reenactment in the arena, a grotesque display meant to mock both Nero and the tragic transformation Sporus endured, the final thread of endurance snapped. Rome's arenas were built for blood and spectacle, for amusement, for dominance, for cruelty turned into entertainment. To enter that arena in humiliation was not merely punishment, it was annihilation. Sporus understood. The world had stripped him of name, identity, body, future. But there remained one thing untouched, the ability to choose the terms of his final act. Nero, with all his power, had denied him choice in life. Vitellius sought to deny him dignity in death. And so Sporus acted, quietly, deliberately. He claimed the one freedom that tyranny could never fully steal, the freedom to refuse further harm. He ended his life, not in surrender, but in reclamation, a final rebellion whispered in the face of empire. History often forgets victims when it remembers emperors. It records monuments, not scars. Yet Sporus's life, brief, tragic, and brutally shaped by the fantasies of men who misunderstood power as possession, stands as a haunting reminder. He was not a symbol of decadence, though history once framed him so. He was a symbol of survival, of the quiet resistance of a soul that refused to disappear even as the world tried to unmake him. His story forces us to reconsider the nature of power. Real power protects. It uplifts. It honors truth rather than replacing it with fantasy. Nero's power, unchecked and unchallenged, turned inward, devoured reason, love, and identity until nothing remained but theater over truth and illusion over humanity. And in that collapse, Sporus was the most devastating casualty, not because he died, but because his life was taken from him long before his final breath. In telling his story, we do not honor Nero's tragedy. We honor Sporus's endurance, his quiet strength, his decision, in the end, to reclaim what had been denied him. He did not get statues. He did not get poets singing his name. He did not get justice. But he held on to the one truth emperors could not rewrite, that his life belonged to him, not to the fantasies of those who controlled him. Empires rise and crumble. Their leaders are praised, then cursed, then studied like relics in books and marble halls. But lives like Sporus's echo in more intimate ways. In our understanding of dignity, in our recognition of the cost of unchecked power, in the memory of those who resist erasure not by grand rebellion, but by refusing to disappear quietly. When we speak of Rome's greatness, we often speak of its marble arches, its legions, its laws. But history's greatness also lies in remembering the quiet tragedies buried under those arches. Sporus's story is one of them, a reminder that behind every imperial triumph and downfall, there are human lives shaped, bent, and sometimes broken by the wills of those who rule. And yet, within the silence he chose, there was a final, radical truth. Though power tried to script his life from beginning to end, Sporus claimed the last line for himself. That, more than any crown or ceremony, is what endures. History is often written by the triumphant, men on horseback, rulers in gold, names carved in stone and thundered across time. Yet some of the most profound lessons come not from those who commanded legions, but from those who carried suffering in silence. In a world awake before dawn, where the city of Rome breathes under the weight of its own grandeur, we end not with the roar of soldiers or the clash of crowns, but with a quiet truth echoing across centuries. Power does not only build monuments, it also leaves shadows. And inside those shadows, lives like Sporus's endure, not erased, but unfinished in ways that demand we remember. After Nero's death, the empire spun forward as if tragedy were merely an inconvenience. Another emperor rose, then fell, and another after that, each convinced he could tame the Roman world in ways the last one failed. Statues toppled, coins were melted to recast new profiles, and senators realigned allegiances like gamblers placing bets on fresh dice. Rome excelled at forgetting, because forgetting is how empires move without breaking under the weight of their past. But forgetting does not erase. It only hides. And the story of Sporus lingers like the breath between pages of a history textbook, quiet, raw, waiting for someone to listen. For a city that worshipped strength, Sporus represented the opposite, vulnerability made visible. Yet vulnerability, in its purest form, is not weakness. It is truth lived in a world that tries to deny it. And Sporus lived truth even when stripped of the language to express it. He endured transformation forced upon him, endured a love that was really lost sharpened into obsession, endured humiliation at the hands of men who mistook cruelty for authority. But endurance is not passive. It requires a kind of will even tyrants cannot recognize. It demands that a person hold onto a sliver of self, even when the world demands fiction. Sporus's final act, choosing death over degradation, was not defeat, it was reclamation. It was the quietest but most powerful form of rebellion, the refusal to be used anymore. The refusal to continue performing a lie authored by someone else's grief. In that final moment, he rewrote his ending, not as the emperor's phantom or Rome's curiosity, but as a human being claiming the last truth available to him. And so we arrive at the heart of this story, not Nero's descent, not Rome's political discord, but the simple, devastating question Sporus's life asks. When the world tries to decide who you are, what part of you remains yours? Rome could reshape laws, rewrite gods, conquer continents, and script the heaven-touched lineage of its rulers. But it could not extinguish the silent flame that flickered inside a boy forced into a life he did not choose. It could not own the quiet awareness inside him, the memory of who he was before silk and jewels became shackles. And when the moment came, Rome could not command his final breath. In the scrolls that survived antiquity, Sporus is too often mentioned only as a footnote in Nero's biography, a shocking anecdote deployed to illustrate decadence. But reduce him to that, and we fall into the same trap Rome did, seeing only the spectacle, not the person. To understand him is to understand something uncomfortable, that history doesn't merely celebrate the powerful, it also records the damage they leave behind. It is easy to say Nero went mad. Easy to say he was vain, impulsive, theatrical. Harder to acknowledge that his madness was enabled, applauded, encouraged by a system built to obey, not question. Power without restraint does not simply corrupt the ruler. It consumes everyone in the orbit of his desires. Sporus's tragedy lies not only in Nero's actions, but in the silence around him. The courtiers who nodded, the nobles who bowed, the world that watched and did nothing. And so this story is not only about Rome. It is about every place, every era, every human structure where power grows louder than truth, where grief becomes tyranny, where affection bends into control, where people become symbols instead of selves, where someone's identity can be remade without their consent because those who hold authority believe they have the right. Sporus's life is not a relic of a barbaric past. It is a mirror we are meant to face. Look closely, and you see not just ancient marble halls drenched in torchlight, but echoes in modern rooms, in relationships twisted by control, in cultures where roles are enforced rather than chosen, in governments that reshape people in service to narrative, in voices dismissed because they inconvenience the powerful. But if history can wound, it can also warn. And warning is a form of memory. Memory is resistance. And resistance, especially quiet, enduring resistance, is its own kind of power. 2,000 years later, Nero's statues are broken, his empire collapsed, his legacy forever tangled with infamy. Sporus left no grand tomb, no dynasty, no triumphal arch. Yet we speak his name now not as the emperor's possession or tragedy's ornament, but as a person reclaiming space in memory. In that sense, Sporus wins. He outlives Nero not in stone, but in meaning. He survives not as property, but as reminder. No empire, no ruler, no force, however absolute, can ever truly own the inner life of another. And sometimes the most extraordinary courage appears not in warriors or kings, but in those who endure a world determined to silence them. So here, our story ends not in applause or marble, but in recognition. May Sporus never again be merely a footnote. May we remember him not as a vessel for someone else's grief, but as a human soul who deserved more than history allowed. And may we carry forward the truth his life forces us to face. Power can command many things: obedience, ritual, fear, silence. But it cannot command the right to define another person's existence. Not truly, not forever, not in the realm where memory becomes justice.